Good morning, secular fam. And I hope that everyone is doing well today. Today, I want to ask you all to make a promise to me. School is starting next week, and in some cases, it's already started. I've heard reports from all over the valley that some local law enforcement agencies are partnering with ICE in that area. And probably the most important thing that you can do to engage with whatever's left of our democracy this weekend is to email your local school board to ask them what plan they have in place to protect students, families, and staff from abduction and placement in a concentration camp. And if you think that that sounds hyperbolic, it is not. We are seeing what these camps look like, that people are not being allowed in, that elected officials aren't being allowed in. We're not cosplaying fascism anymore. We're fully in it. Now, for today, though, because sorry, we keep talking about how every Friday becomes a Rage Friday, but today we might actually, focus on science and joy for a change. So let's take a break from Rage Friday. That is after you find out exactly what school district you're in and you make a plan to email everybody on there. But let's take a break from Rage Friday and enjoy a Science Friday instead, because today we are welcoming special guest Laura Poppick, science journalist and the author of Strata, Stories from Deep Time. Laura is a science and environmental journalist whose stories have appeared in the New York Times, Scientific American, National Geographic, and elsewhere. She has been listed as a finalist for the National Association of Science Writers Science in Society Journalism Award and the Maine Literary Awards. Her debut book, Strata, Stories from Deep Time, provides context for modern environmental change by exploring 4 other moments of global transformation in Earth's deep geologic history. She lives in Portland, Maine. Is there anything that I missed from your bio, Laura, that you'd like to add?
That is great. But yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and for having me.
Absolutely. I'm just going to hand it off to you. And like I said earlier, I will monitor the chat as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you all for showing up here today. It's really nice to be here with you all. And I'm excited to dive in a little bit about my book. But I mentioned earlier, feel free to shoot questions in the chat and I'll try to address them as they come up as I can. Um, and I see, yep, great. Thank you for dropping a link to where you can find this book. Obviously, that's the hope. It came out about 2.5 weeks ago, so just trying to get the word out so that it lands in people's hands, at least people who are interested in reading it. So thank you for dropping that link in the chat. And I will share my screen for my presentation. Okay. So here we are. So yeah, the whole deal with this book is that it's a book about geology and the layers of narrative in our planet's crust that appear as strata on the surface of the planet. And by strata, I mean layers of rock, and they are often, at least in the context of this book, sedimentary rocks. So we can get into what that means, but that is what that word means. The strata is like a layer of the earth made up of often sedimentary rocks, which is the remnant of like ancient surfaces on the earth that have turned to stone over the course of millions of years. And so with this book, I was hoping that when I set off to write this book, I hoped to help readers do a number of things. Recognize that we have these stories all around us in the world that we live in. Maybe appreciate rocks in a new or different way. I think geology is something that people aren't necessarily taught about in school. There is might not be a required class that people take. But there's just so much awe that can be found and joy that can be found in the rock record. So I wanted to share that. The rock record also gives us kind of some context for the moment that we're in right now. We're obviously experiencing a lot of change, a lot of different sorts of crises on the planet right now. And it can be helpful to look back, not just in human history, but also to zoom way back to geologic history to understand kind of what makes this time different, what makes it the same as other periods of change. And then that can kind of inform how we decide to move forward with a whole number of different things and how we kind of interact with the environment and the planet. So that's the spiel. And so with this book, I focused on 4 moments in Earth's deep past to kind of give a sweeping look at some pivotal moments in deep time. And I'll be talking, kind of giving a preview of 2 of those sections during this talk today. Um, so next slide. So just to give a visual of what I mean by strata, this is an example of a canyon wall that is filled with these layers, and these are ancient what we call sedimentary environments, and all that means is like ancient sandy environments. So that might be the bottom of an ocean, or it might be a dune field, or it might be a riverbed, like anywhere where you can imagine sediments kind of gathering is the type of environment preserved in these types of layers. And this is a picture that I took right as I was kind of conceiving of this book idea. And it was this sense of awe that I felt looking at this canyon that I wanted to share with people. And anyone can feel awe looking at this, but I realized that I had this kind of geologic lens that not everyone else might have the privilege of having, just because I briefly studied geology. I was a geology major in college. I worked for 1 year after college in a geology lab, so a total of 5 years. In the scheme of things, it's not that much time, but it was enough. It was more than the average person, and enough to give me an extra layer of appreciation of sitting and looking at layers like this. And that is, yeah, I just wanted to give folks the chance to look out at something like this and think about, okay, well, what time period are we looking at? How small am I? How small is my life compared to the rocks and the time encapsulated in this cliffside? How long did it take for this all to accumulate? These are the types of questions that can kind of like add more layers and fun and joy into sitting with rocks like this. Um, and more than just the joy, there's also so much information that can be gathered, like sometimes super granular information that can be found in these grains of sand and silt. And I love this quote from Rachel Carson in The Sea Around Us: "The sediments are a sort of epic poem of the earth. When we are wise enough, perhaps we can read in them all of past history." And I actually start my book with that quote because I think it's just so wonderful. So that's kind of the heart of why these things, you know, matter, because we can learn so much from these narratives in the crust. So before I dive right into the 2 moments in Earth history that I'm going to talk about in my presentation, I just want to make sure we're clear on what we mean by deep time, because I know that it's a phrase that not everyone's heard of necessarily. I kind of use it casually now, having been in this field for a while, but I know not everyone's familiar with it. So what does it mean? Um, it means geologic time, as you can imagine. Based on the context of my book, it's the 4.5 billion years of Earth history that we have before us. But why is it called deep? So the idea here is that sediments accumulate from bottom to top. So the deeper you go, the older you go. And so it's really old time. It's ancient time. It's time that's deep in the earth, that's been preserved deep in the earth, that maybe is now at the surface thanks to tectonic plates pushing up layers, erosion, exposing layers. But at some point, they were deep down in the earth, and that is what we mean by deep time. But where did this phrase come from? And what I love about it is that it actually didn't come from a scientist at all. It came from a writer. So John McPhee, the author of Basin and Range, kind of coined this phrase deep time in 1981. So this is the quote: "Numbers do not seem to work well with regard to deep time. Any number above a couple of thousand years, 50,000, 50 million, will with nearly equal effect awe the imagination to the point of paralysis." So he wrote this book about geology and geologic time, and he was trying to convey just how impossible it is to comprehend 4.5 billion years, even 100 million years, 50,000. All these numbers are so difficult to comprehend, and yet they're worth trying to at least understand the events of, even if we can't exactly tangibly understand the amount of time held within deep time. So basin and range is where this word came from, and now scientists use it freely in scientific journal articles. I mean, it really is just part of the geologic jargon at this point, which I kind of love because also in this book, John McPhee talks about how geology is kind of feel like the humanities of the sciences, which in many ways is true, especially of the study of strata and stratigraphy, because it is the study of these narratives that often have to be kind of revised and edited as new techniques come about and new laboratory equipment allows these researchers to study strata in finer detail. These stories have to be revised. And so I think that's an apt metaphor to say that geology is the humanities of the sciences. And I think it's that much more fitting that an author came up with this phrase that's now kind of so embedded within this field of science. Um, so in my kind of journey through deep time and strata, I cover 4 moments, as I've said, and I have this illustration from a really talented illustrator, Sarah Gilman, who was able to share illustrations for kind of like the section openings of each section within the book. And this comes at the beginning, the prologue, just to give you a sense of where these kind of moments in geologic time fall in relation to one another. And so the idea is that if you stretch your arms out, so this is you're seeing one half of an arm, but the idea is if you stretch your both of your arms out and imagine geologic time, like the beginning of Earth starting with your left hand over here. Um, the first episode I write about comes halfway through that time. So there's so much time before I even start being able to write anything because the rock record is a little bit fuzzier in the first half of Earth history, but that's billions of years that we know some about, but not enough that I felt was kind of offered enough to write a whole book section. So that's part of why I started halfway through. And halfway through is where we have the first rise of oxygen in the atmosphere. So that's going to be the first section that I talk about with you all. Um, so just real quick before I dive into the oxygen, I just wanted to show you like, how do we know anything about the timeline? Like, how do you know that oxygen happened halfway through and these other events that I wrote about happened after? I just wanted you to get a sense of some of the geologic kind of clues that we have. And these here are grains of zircon. It's a mineral that has trace amounts of uranium in it. And so you can measure the ratio of uranium and its daughter. I guess so you measure the ratio of uranium and lead to get the age of when this zircon formed. And so that's how the oldest rocks on Earth are dated. And it's a really helpful technique to date material that might not otherwise work for techniques you might be more familiar with, like carbon dating and stuff, doesn't work for things that are as old as the oldest rocks on Earth. So these are zircons. Um, And we can use those zircons to help us start to kind of get our sense of a narrative around when and how did oxygen first accumulate in the atmosphere? And how do we even know that it wasn't here in the first place? These are some of the questions that I tackle in that section of the book. So this is a rock sample that I had a chance to look at when I was doing my reporting. This is in the lab of a researcher at Caltech whose name is Woody Fisher. And Woody has studied the rise of oxygen throughout his career. And um, he has a few different ways of kind of trying to understand the timing and the kind of impetus of this event. And some of these clues are really straightforward once you kind of know what you're looking at. And this is one example of that. And in geology, these are referred to as proxies. So I'll explain what that means. So what we're looking at here is maybe some of you have, or maybe you're familiar with this kind of gold glinty mineral here. This is called pyrite. And I imagine, even if you've seen chunks of pyrite around, I imagine you've maybe never seen it quite in this form. And I had never seen it quite in this form either. These are my hands. So this is me holding this thing, and I'd never seen pyrite like that before. And to me, what was weird was that there are these really round spheres of pyrite, and there's like a fluid flow to these pieces of like little, almost like little shards of pyrite. I'd never seen anything like this before. And I said that to Woody when I was holding this in his lab, and he's like, "Yeah, that you think you see that, and you think that was a really different world." And so it turns out that, as I was kind of using my geologic deduction skills, I was noticing like this really does look fluid. It looks like this was maybe um, getting pummeled along at the bottom of a river, say. So this is one thing you might do if you're working as a stratigrapher, you're looking for like what kind of environment might you find this movement in. So I'm seeing fluid flow. And Woody said, yep, that's right. But in today's world, you can't have pyrite flowing in water because pyrite will. Sorry, did you have a question you want to jump in with?
Well, somebody in the chat actually does. And I figured it's going along with the conversation that, the presentation right now. So the question comes from Phil, and he says, question, in uranium lead dating, how do we determine the amount of lead that was originally in the rock when it formed so that we can figure out how much of the lead is uranium that has decayed and determine the age of the rock accurately?
Yeah,
Um,
that's a good question. So the zircon itself is going to be a very contained kind of vessel. It's very sturdy. That's part of what's so helpful about zircon for dating rocks is that it's so sturdy that it will be contained. So it's going to just contain the lead that has been kind of the result of that radioactive decay. But that's a good question. Um, so back to this specimen. And I just want to back up too, in case it wasn't clear. When I say there wasn't oxygen in the atmosphere during this time that we're talking about, I mean the gas. So oxygen, the element, has always existed on the planet. It's a very common element, but it took halfway through Earth's existence for the gas to come together, which is two of the atoms of oxygen stuck together. Um, so what we're looking at here is pyrite that's been pummeling around in water. Obviously, water has oxygen in it, H2O, but water back when this was being formed, evidently, based on what we're looking at here, did not contain dissolved oxygen because if it did, Woody told me, this pyrite would have dissolved. So pyrite is very reactive with water. It rusts, it dissolves to nothing. So there would never be time for like a shard to roll and pummel for enough days, months, years to get kind of eroded down to these perfect spheres like this here. And so this is an example of a proxy. So kind of like you can't go back and measure exactly how much oxygen was or was not on the planet at a certain time, but you can use something like a stand-in, which is a proxy for that. And this is an example of a proxy for a time before oxygen, because this whole scene that we're looking at just could not exist if there had been dissolved oxygen in the water. Um, so that's one of a number of examples of what we find in the rock record that demonstrates that there was a time before action, and then there's a time that we stop finding things like this. We stop finding what's called detrital pyrite. It's pyrite that is rounded and eroded in a way that could only have happened by kind of flowing in water. So the fact that there was this and then there wasn't shows that there was some change. And there are a number of other examples of this. Some of them are chemical examples in sediments. Some of them are other physical examples. You start to see, for example, when there's more oxygen in the atmosphere, you start to see more rusting. You start to see more red rocks. And that's because rust requires oxygen. And oxygen rusts metals. Like you can't not rust metals, once you have a certain amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. And so these are the types of examples of, or these are the types of proxies that geologists are looking for in the rock record that they're then trying to find zircons and other ways to then date those kind of windows into time to get a sense of when things happened. And once you know what comes first and what comes next in your narrative, you start to understand maybe a cause and effect. And so another member of Woody's team who's helping with who has helped with this project is Usha Lingappa. She's actually moved on to UC Berkeley and is no longer working on this project specifically, but she did work on it on kind of the question around the rise of oxygen as a PhD student with Woody. And this is her um, with a bunch of rock core. So that's like a rock that's been collected with something almost like an apple core that goes into the earth and pulls out rock that's can be super helpful for getting kind of like a very complete long record um, in a way that might not be available just right at the surface. So I believe we're going top to bottom this way. So on this side of things is the most recent rock, and then we go back in time. And she's pointing to an area that starts to get red. And so that would be an example of an area like, okay, well, we've got oxygen there because there's a bunch of rust. At least that's a thought. Um, and she conducted her thesis looking at these rocks and their association with another element that she thinks might be key to the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere. And that element is um, manganese. And I won't get too into the details. You can read the book. It's a lot of chemistry that takes a little bit explaining, but the short of it is that manganese actually plays a really important role in the production of oxygen today. And the way that we get oxygen today, as you probably have a sense of is through photosynthesis, through production from plants like the trees behind me, algae, but there are also bacteria that can photosynthesize. And because bacteria are kind of like the simplest, they're single-celled, they're the simplest of the photosynthesizers that produce oxygen, the idea is that they were probably the very first ones to do it. And for them to evolve to do it would have required some sort of like energetic shift. It would have required them to develop new machinery to be able to do this kind of thermodynamic thing. Um, Turns out manganese is an element that's very important to that process in the modern Earth. And so she was curious if that was true of potentially ancient bacteria as well. So she was looking at a manganese layer in this core. Um, and this is kind of her draw. She's also a beautiful artist. So I just wanted to include this drawing that she made, trying to explain how manganese plays into photosynthesis. And, oop, I just, let's see if I can go back. And yeah, you can read this section of the book to see what she found, but it's basically they were very excited to find a close association with this element that they know is important to photosynthesis, and they found bacterial remains in very close association with the manganese layer in this core. So can read the book to see what they might glean from that. But I just wanted to give that as an example of kind of like the nitty-gritty types of um, evidence that these scientists are looking for to piece together how this process may have evolved to create the world that we live in today. Um, so let's see. I think I'm gonna move on actually. I had some beautiful rocks to show you, but I'm gonna move on to show you um, this here. So did you want to jump in with a question?
No, sorry. I thought that there was a question. It's just a couple of guys in the chat being super nerdy and talking about uranium and all that. So sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. So yeah, before we move on to the next section in the book, I just want to also share, it can maybe feel a little esoteric, like why does it matter when oxygen arose? Like why are we doing all this work um, to understand Earth history? And I think there are a number of answers to this that I find compelling. One being like it kind of gives us a fundamental understanding of how the Earth works, which will help us treat the planet better and work with it better moving forward. Um, but there are also like real implications for these times in Earth history for actually our modern world, our modern economy, the way that our modern world is built. And so for oxygen in particular, um, the absence of oxygen in the atmosphere actually resulted in the bulk of the iron deposits that we have across the planet today. The ones that are kind of mined to create steel and other products. Um, a huge proportion of these iron deposits came from before oxygen was in the atmosphere, and that's because iron reacts with oxygen, just like pyrite does. And before there was any oxygen dissolved in the oceans, there was much, much, much more iron dissolved in oceans, and that allowed these deposits of huge deposits of iron to then precipitate to the seafloor, and those have since turned into these ore bodies that are mined. So I actually went down into one of these ore bodies in Minnesota. Um, so I just wanted to show you what that looked like and to help you see how like, yeah, these moments seem so distant, yet they literally like appear in our everyday lives. My car probably has steel, my kitchen has appliances with steel, and all that, was made from rock with iron from this time before oxygen. So this is what we're looking at here. And there are these beautiful, what are called banded iron formations that are another proxy that have been used to try to understand the timing of the rise of oxygen. If you ever or find yourself in northern Minnesota, this is the Sudan iron mine. It's open to the public for tours. It's also a state park, and it's really beautiful. Okay, I'm going to move us along, and we are going to move on to the third section of my book, which is the mud section. Let's see here. So we were at about 2.5 billion years ago with the iron, with the oxygen, and now we are at way further along on our arm, and for 458 million years ago with the rise of mud. So what do I mean by this? Sorry, my throat is drying up right now. When and why did mud first accumulate on land? How do we know this? Why does it matter? Um, so this is a story, this kind of story within the book came to um, my awareness through this um, figure that I found just kind of looking at potential material to write from in the journal Science. And I found this review of an article about the rise of mud on land. And I was like, what do you mean rise of mud? When I think of mud, at least back then, I thought of mud as something that's always been here. It never had to rise up. It's just been here. But based on this story that I was reading in Science, I learned that it's actually not the case. There's always been mud on Earth. But there was not a ton of mud on the land, on continents, until there was something for that mud to cling to. So the idea is that mud would kind of form. Mud is essentially just like wet clay and silt, like the finest particles. So those particles would form through erosion, whether it's glaciers or rain or wind. And it would form, but all of those materials would get washed into rivers and down to the bottom of the ocean. And so the idea is that there was maybe very minimal amounts of mud on the continents. But once plants started kind of adding a little bit of texture to the continents, those silts and clays were able to stick to those that texture and then stick to themselves because bits of clay are actually electrically attracted to one another. They have this electrical stickiness, and then all of a sudden we have this rise of mud in the rock record. So why does this matter? What does that mean? That's what this whole section is about. And it matters for a number of reasons, but one reason it matters is that once we have sticky banks of rivers, the rivers start flowing in really different ways. So before there was any kind of vegetation on continents, rivers looked like this. They were braided, like for the most part, they looked like this. There were all sorts of different types of rivers, but the idea is that they were more often rivers that braided and kind of broke over their channels. They never really fully flooded because they were so kind of uh, incoherent. They weren't sticky enough to even flood. They would just kind of reroute their braids, and that was that. Um, Once you have plants and mud kind of on the, obviously there are plants here too. I can explain in a moment how we can have both at once. But if you stick with me, once there's more plants and stickiness and texture along the sides of rivers, they have the capacity to actually become sturdier. And when they're sturdier, all those braids actually can condense into a single meandering stream. And once that happens, the river channels become narrower, and then they do have the capacity to flood. And once a river floods, then you have floodplains, and then you have maybe mudflats, and then you have areas where you're actually accumulating material, silt, clay. This mud is then now traveling outside of the river onto the banks. And then you have your first soils building up. And then you have places where animals might be able to live and forests might be able to grow. So the evolution of the surface of the planet with the rise of mud created all these possibilities. And, today, human society rose along the banks of rivers on these mudflats on these floodplains that have such rich soils that continue to be some of the most fertile lands on the planet today. And so they are these like very important habitats for all sorts of plant and animal life that kind of dictates how the spread of life across the planet. So that's one reason, one of several reasons that the rise of mud means a lot to the planet. So for this part of the book, I traveled to this beautiful part of the world, which is Dingle, Ireland. And Dingle has rocks from some of the earliest days of plants on land. And so I traveled there to look at those rocks with these two folks. So this is Neil Davies, who's a professor at Cambridge, and this is a graduate student of his. And Neil Davies is kind of responsible for identifying this period of mud that rose associated with the rise of plants. He and another graduate student of his were the ones that produced the work that led to that diagram that I showed a little bit earlier. And so I traveled with them to get a sense of what they look for when they're looking for evidence of mud. And, one of my favorite things that Neil repeated a few times was, it might sound boring, mundane, you're looking at silts and clays, but he says, you have to appreciate what's boring to appreciate what's special in the rock record. So you have to appreciate, and that kind of applies to a whole suite of different kind of issues you might have trying to suss out what's going on in the rock record, but it applies to this rise of mud as well, because it might seem kind of boring. You're just looking at silts and clays, but you have to be okay with that to then recognize like, oh, actually there's a shift in how much there's all of a sudden orders of 10 times more silt and clay on land once plants arise than before there were plants. And the only way that he was able to identify that tenfold increase was like bearing with what might be considered boring material, and in search of this kind of deeper meaning. So while we were out there, we were looking for evidence, like how do we know that there were plants here? Sometimes you can find fossil plants, but it's not always possible to find fossils. But you can find other evidence that there might have been plants around. And so to the right here are two examples of structures, like textures that you might find in rocks that are evidence of the environment that might be conducive to plants. So on the top here, we have what's called a strip of calcrete. And what that is kind of like the chemical halo of a plant root. So if you think of like if you have a tea kettle that might gather kind of like a white residue over time, this is similar to that. And the idea is that there may have been a root here that allowed water to come down and then dry up, come down, dry up, and then over time it creates this layer. And so it's not an actual root fossil, but it's the kind of area where a root may have been. So this came from this collection of rocks here. So now we're looking at, something that to Neil's mind may have been like a floodplain with mud and roots here. And down here, similarly, it's a different example of something that you might find where the ground has gotten wet and then it's gotten dry and gotten wet and dry. This is called ferricrete. So calcrete is named after the calcium in here, and ferricrete is named after the ferry, the iron that makes this red here. And again, this is showing us an environment that would have gotten wet, dry, and that seems like something that you would find in a floodplain. So these are the types of clues that someone like Neil looks for to say like, okay, we're probably in a floodplain. And that means that right now, this is a time when there were floodplains and there was mud accumulating alongside what may have been roots indicated by the calcrete. So this is another little spot that we looked at elsewhere along the coast of Dingle just to kind of drive this point home. It's a really beautiful part of the world. And I'll just get to, because this is kind of in the cove. And then when we turned to the left, we had all of these. So, we had the calcrete earlier, and then all of a sudden we had this wonderful view of these kind of root halos, deep roots. And so now it's pretty clear that we're in kind of an ancient floodplain where there would have been plants growing, but we know based on the age estimation of these rocks that this was very early on in that time. And it's clues like this that allow us to kind of find the timeline of when plants would have first arrived on the continents. And we did get lucky and find one actual piece of what Neil thought could have been an actual fossil of a root too. So we've got our chemical halo, but then bingo, we actually found some material that looked like it could have been a piece of a root that's, over 400 million years old, fossilized piece of root. So we had a moment where we found this very poetic, the cows are like the color of the strata, which is beautiful, but they're eating plants above rocks from a time when plants maybe first began evolving on the surface of the planet. So there's something really beautiful there, just reminding us that we're all connected through time and space. And it's the rock record kind of gives a tangible meaning to that phrase. It's like it's real. We are all kind of connected to the earth in these various ways because these events and these materials made our lives here possible. So what I want to do real quick before we head to, yep, go ahead.
I do have one question here. I think it's coming. Just a second here. This one comes from Phil again. Once sediments are deposited, how long does it generally take for these sediments to harden into solid rock?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it really depends on the environment and the types of sediments, but we're talking usually millions, millions of years. And so that's what I mean when I refer to deep time. I think some people refer to deep time, they might consider like 1,000 years deep time. And I was kind of joking about this with a friend recently because I was like, no, people say like, oh, deep time is like the last ice age. It's like the last ice age is like yesterday. That's like humans were around. But when geologists are referring to deep time, in my experience, they're referring to at least that amount of time it takes to create a rock. So millions of years, but it really depends. And what's interesting is like even when the sediments have turned to rock and then some tectonic event, it's because it's not only turning to rock, but then for it to be at the surface requires another tectonic event that brings it back up. And maybe erosion that exposes it. But even then, when I was looking at some mud with Neil on the side of the road in Dingle, I kind of wiped my finger across the ancient 400 million year old silt, and some of it kind of came off on my finger. So it wasn't like fully solidified even then, which I thought was really interesting. So that is the answer to that. So I definitely want to save time for more questions, but one other thing, well, before I move on, I'll say that this section of the book looks into like, what was it about this time? Was it only that plants helped mud stick around alongside rivers more? Did plants like create more mud too? Like a tenfold increase is a lot. So we're looking at like what exactly happened then and why does it matter? And beyond the shapes of rivers, the formation of floodplains, it also has implications for the cycling of carbon in and out of the atmosphere. Muds are really good at holding carbon underground, so that kind of added a new element to the global carbon cycle, which then impacted global climate. So it really is this major kind of player in the Earth system and how the Earth works. So I get into that in that section of the book. Um, but one last thing I want to get at, which was something that I hoped readers might feel empowered to do after or while reading my book, is to just become familiar with the rocks around them or rocks and places they're interested in. Not necessarily like, oh, is it a gabbro or is it a basalt or is it a granite? Like, not necessarily what type of rock, although that's great if that's what you're interested in, but the age of the rock and try to think like, oh, the rocks outside my home or my kid's school or my workplace are from a time when plants were just evolving or from a time before oxygen, like whatever it might be. I think that context can add a lot of richness to our lives if we know even just a few little like key points about the age of rocks around us. And so I'll give you an example from around so I live in Maine. So in Maine, we have this geologic map from the Maine Geological Survey. And I was interested in writing a story about the oldest rocks in the state. And all I had to do was look at this map. And it takes a little bit of interpretation, but once you kind of key your mind in, it seems like there are a lot of science-minded folks here. So maybe you'll enjoy this. You just basically read this chart here, tells us that these are a million years ago. So the highest number is the most million years ago. That means these are the oldest rocks. So if you look for this color, you will find the oldest rocks in the state. And so I found the oldest rocks in the state down here, and I wrote a story about what the world looked like when those rocks formed. Um, but I live in Portland. They're the rocks of this orange color. You can look here and start saying Precambrian, Ordovician. These are words that you may not be familiar with, but if you plug those, into Google or if you read parts of my book, you might learn about what the world looked like. So I just wanted to give a plug for geologic maps because they're easier to interpret than you might think, and they can be really fun to just carry around when you travel or at home or wherever. So yeah, that's my plug. I'll pause there for more questions.
I will say that geologic maps are also some of my favorite maps. I am not I'm more of an I was an English teacher for many years, and we always have, we always make that joke. I was an English teacher, not a math teacher, so like I struggled with science, but I loved what you said about being about geology being humanities. I also loved I had a great professor at the community college level for my physical geography class. I loved that class so much, and he made it so fun. And I was like, this is like, I know how to predict weather now. Like, I felt so smart.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So and I've wondered this a lot because, okay, so back in 2018, I went on, there was a vacancy on this private boating trip, a whitewater rafting trip down the bottom of the Grand Canyon in the Colorado River. And for me, it was just life changing, but I was also terrified. I'm not a great swimmer. It was only the second river that I had ever gone on, and it has the biggest rapids in North America. So like, I've always been curious because like I wish that I had time that I wasn't so terrified that I had actually looked in that guidebook a little bit more because I did. I looked. I mean, it is the closest I will ever get to spiritual. You know what I mean? Like just
Yeah.
being able to see the canyon walls and how huge they are. I mean, it's like when you go to a big city and you look up at the skyscrapers, but I think it's like 3 times higher than the skyscrapers from where you are in the boat. Have you
Mhm.
ever like I'm curious, do a lot of geologists go on trips like that to see the canyon walls and to like, really get into, I mean, I know you're a journalist and you study geology, but I'm just curious if that's like a thing that people do.
For sure. Yeah. People have field sites in these incredible places, which is part of what's so neat about geology too, is that you get to kind of access these places that might be more, you get to do it for work essentially. You can go to the Grand Canyon for fun, but these guys get to do it for work. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, canyons like that are really important for stratigraphers because there is so much material exposed. And there are researchers who I spoke to who also described it as sort of like a spiritual experience to sit with these. So you're not alone. And I too feel like it's a form of spirituality to feel that connected with what literally formed us, right?
Yeah, after the first couple rapids, and I was like, okay, I haven't died yet. I might make it through. Like, and you get to go off on these little day trips where you see these waterfalls. And like there was like the first time we had one of those day trips where I got to stop and I touched like it was like this is millions and millions of years old. Like this, it was just it was a very like moving experience. And I just went off while everybody else was swimming and playing in the waterfall, and I just cried, because of the
Mhm.
sheer beauty of it all. We do have a question here from Farrell, and she says, can we learn about human life from strata?
Great question. Yeah, in a certain, so it depends. So human life is, as I was saying, is much more recent in geologic time, but it's still, has been going on for a while. So it's about 300,000 years maybe that Homo sapiens have evolved. Um, so you can learn about humans. I mean, I don't know if you mean like literal humans that have lived or the evolution, the like slow evolution of humans. But if you're talking about like how we got here, then to begin with, then all of this is relevant because we needed oxygen to be here. We needed there to be animals that live on land because we needed, there to be legs and we needed there to be backbones and all these things led to us existing. So in that sense, absolutely, we can learn about our most ancient ancestors from strata.
Mm-hmm. Here's a really good question coming from Corey, and she asks, "How do you expect future geology to look millions of years after this plastic era?"
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I definitely do think of that. And I ended the story that I wrote, this one that about the oldest rocks in Maine, I kind of end with thinking like, oh, what would our lives look like to a future geologist? Yeah, I think it's hard to say. It really depends on the location. I think there were certainly, I mean, I have no idea. I think plastic probably won't I haven't studied this, so I can't, but I don't think it can persist through the melting of the mantle. So I think that the plastic itself obviously won't look the same it does to us, but I'm sure that the material within the plastic will be chemically there.
Mm,
Um, yeah, it's going to be. definitely striking, but I think what's really humbling is to think like, well, how thick is that layer going to be, right? And I think, we feel
Yeah.
so kind of overwhelmed by what's happening right now in the world, and it is overwhelming. There's a lot to that demands our attention, rightfully so. But when you're sitting on a canyon wall and imagining like, okay, well, my life is like maybe 80
Yeah.
years,
This much.
and in that canyon wall, it's like maybe there's like a piece of dust that I don't know, it's just so, so small. And all of humanity is so small, like the amount of time. So time will tell, but there we will definitely leave a mark. There will be evidence of us. It just will depend on where you are on the planet and how things go, like exactly what that will look like.
Yeah, I would say we might as the mark that humans are going to leave, I would say, is maybe like a skid mark, you know. It's not a good mark. Um, my other question to you, given what's going on and what seems to be an endless attack on all the sciences, right? Like, I mean, it's an attack on facts. um, what does it look like for post-secondary, you know, research funding in well, and again, in the field of geology or in the field of this particular branch of science altogether? What does that look like for researchers these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually haven't been as in touch with the folks I interviewed for this book more recently, so I don't know for them in particular. But broadly speaking, I mean, a lot of researchers in this realm do rely on federal funds that might not be available, and so I think that there is going to be some scrambling to figure out what that looks like. I mean, there are different sources of funding that researchers use, so my hope, is that it will persist, but I know that people are going to be losing jobs or losing opportunities. And it's what I'll add is that this is this is kind of a pivotal moment in our understanding of Earth's past. I mean, this is a relatively new field of science. We're learning so much more this century than we knew last century. And this is like fundamental stuff of like where we came from, how the Earth works. Like all of this is really fundamental to who we are and how we can interact with the planet in a way that's like um kind of supportive of the planet. Not to say that aren't other schools of thought that can help you understand how to treat the planet well. There are obviously those as well, but these um, details from the rock record can give us some tangible ideas of how, for example, if countries decide to geoengineer the climates, as some countries are debating, which means like yeah, kind of intentionally cooling the planet. What are the implications of that? Like, what are the scientific implications? And we don't know for sure, but we can look to the rock record to give us ideas of how the planet reacts. So all that's to say is that there's actually some real tangible, important reasons why yeah, should be funding this work.
Hmm. Well, and like, just I think it was last week where we had somebody coming in, and it was another kind of Science Friday, and they were talking about, people with the best of intentions bringing in these invasive species. It's like I know river rafters, who have been doing this for a long time, and many of the shorelines along the rivers in Arizona have been taken over by tamarack trees, or
Mm,
tamis, and so like, a lot of them will actually now, I know of some like boaters who, have been working with local conservation. Like, and I joked last week about how I think it's so that they can get on the river without a permit. But, like there are, thank you, desert pollinators. That's what it was. Yes, about pollinators. Um,
mm,
oh shoot, there was another question in here. Hold on just a second. Somebody had a question. There it is. Yes. Okay. Farrell says, hold on, where did it go? I just saw, oh no, yeah, Farrell. Is there evidence of war in Strata?
mm. Well, that's a great question. Again, it depends on I don't know the answer to that. I would say it'd be hard because war again is like a relatively recent phenomenon in Earth history, and it may not have had time to accumulate in strata, but there are like more recent layers. For example, like Pompeii there are layers of volcanic ash, and that you might consider that strata. Strata can also be like actual modern day. layers that haven't hardened yet. So if you go to the beach and you see like, I guess you guys, I don't know how close, you don't live very close to the beach, but if you go to like a riverbed and you see kind of loose sediments, those are also strata. They just haven't turned to rock yet. So I'm sure that there are loose like sediments, strata where there's evidence of war, and you could learn something about the environment where that war was taking place with the strata.
Hmm. Hmm. And here's one last comment, well, and a lot of praise. Like seriously, people are really leaning into their science brains today,
Of
and
that.
the chat is very detailed. It's good. It's great. But Alex says also research into glacial melting seems to suggest that the reduced weight on Earth's crust is adding to plates shifting and greater earthquakes and volcanoes. Yeah. And then somebody else said, thinking about George Carlin pushing back on the phrase "save the earth." The earth will be fine. Humans are, pardon my French, fucked, but the earth will be good. No worries.
Yeah, and that's something that definitely was kind of thrown around when I was a geology student in college, and I think, and that did, bring me comfort. And I think the further along we get in time, it doesn't bring me as much comfort anymore because I'm like, yeah, well, we don't know how fine. I mean, the Earth will restabilize somehow, but it's hard to know. There are permanent changes to Earth, as we've seen. The rise of oxygen was permanent. The rise of plants is permanent. So there is some permanence to the change, so we do have to be mindful of that. But it is
Mhm.
true that I think what does bring me solace is that the Earth does have these stabilizing ways, and this will probably not be an anomaly. So it will find some way to stabilize, and we may or may not be part of that.
So, okay, that kind of goes along with how I close every single discussion on Fridays. I usually ask, like, because we are living in such troubled times, what gives you hope? And that sounds like a hopeful thing, but I don't want to steal your thunder because maybe it's something else that gives you hope.
Yeah, honestly, there's a lot obviously to be concerned about, and I am deeply concerned, but I find a lot of hope in all sorts of things, including the Earth's capacity to withstand change and including all the people who are so passionate and working so hard to understand, and they'll continue to do that. I think there will always be passion and curiosity in how the Earth works, and I think we will continue to find, there is this, people in the audience are interested, hopefully other people. The more we understand what we can gain, whether it's awe or grounding or whatever it might be from the rock record, I think the more appreciation there might be for the planet, and that gives me hope.
I love that answer. And yeah, I think, and you know what, for me it's these Fridays where we have consistently, I would say, like 50 people who show up on a Friday during their lunch hour, and they are ready to hear about anything from this kind of research that you do and this kind of writing that you do. And I really do want to say again to everybody who's watching today, please run right out and buy this book. Let's see. And the name of it again is Strata, Stories from Deep Time. So please, changing hands. I know that there she goes. She put it up there again. We like to support our local bookstores, but of
Thank you.
course,
Yeah.
you can buy it at Amazon if you really need to. But we're just so happy that you joined us today. And thank you for giving us some hope. And I hope you have a great weekend, Laura.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was lovely, and thank you for all your great questions and for being here, and I hope you have a great weekend as well.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.